Welcome to the Curious About Nature podcast. This is a podcast for folks who want to connect with nature and rewild childhood. Hosted by Rachel Mills, Buttercup Learning's founder, an educator with 20 plus years of experience with a passion for animation, the natural world, and conservation. Rachel focuses on getting digital kids outdoors and having fun in nature, promoting well-being and a can-do attitude to local wildlife conservation and sustainable living. Join her and her guests for their stories, experiences, and tips to support outdoor learning and nature connection.
Welcome to the Curious About Nature podcast. Today, I welcome Josh Forwood, a wildlife and science documentary cameraman and drone operator. Hi there, Josh.
Hi, thanks very much.
It's lovely to have you on. Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I live in Bristol these days, which is the global centre for wildlife filmmaking. But I'm originally from southwest London. I've been in the industry for about 14 years.
Did you always want to get into wildlife filmmaking?
I've had quite a few different careers in the past. I was a civil engineer for a while and I've done a few other things, but I've always had a real passion for wildlife technology and cameras. And then I decided to pursue the technology and camera direction and went to university to do media technology. And when I was about halfway through my course, I realized that wildlife was actually the direction I wanted to go in. I hadn't really put two and two together and realized that I could pair both my love of wildlife and tech and cameras into one career. And that was where I tried to angle myself from that point.
So how did you get into the making of and building of drones and then obviously photography and filmmaking? Maybe explain what a drone is.
Sure. So a drone, you might be able to see some of them behind me up here on the shelves. Basically, traditionally it's a quadcopter, so you've got four propellers and they're small remote-controlled, like helicopters, often with cameras attached that you can fly around and film from the air. I got into them many years ago just as a hobby. It was before they were really used for TV or film or anything less than high-budget cinematic film, at least. And I was just building them, flying them as a hobby at home. And then I started to realize that it was going to be more of a thing in the industry. There was a colleague for a company I was working at the time that had started to take it up for work. And so I transferred my drone time into doing that for work. And that became a big part of my career from then onwards.
So you obviously got into wildlife film production. What was your first experience?
I got into documentary TV production. My first job in the industry was as a runner for an independent production company in Bristol. My first role on a particular production wasn't specifically wildlife, but with a nature element, was on a show called River Monsters, which was for Discovery and ITV. And that was my first job, which meant that I was able to be out in the middle of a rainforest, surrounded by the biodiversity and experiencing and interacting with the wildlife in that element. So that was my first sort of step into the world. And it was quite an amazing first step.
Yeah, it sounds like a really rewarding job, being able to be that close to wildlife and to experience nature. What would you say has been your most rewarding experience so far?
Oh, I'd say one of the most rewarding productions I've worked on in terms of what I think has resulted from it. It wasn't actually wildlife. It was one of the science shows I worked on, which was a 2-hour special for PBS Nova in the US on climate change called Polar Extremes. And the actual act of filming that was amazing. We got to go to some incredible places. We were down in Antarctica for a while, very northern unexplored parts of the Arctic and stuff. It was amazing to work on, but being able to speak to some of the scientists that were on the ground doing the in-field research that sort of informed us of what's actually happening around the planet at the moment, and that film then going on to be not just broadcast, but because it's PBS Nova, it was then used in schools around America and other things like that, just helping spread word and educate people about the sciences that are going on at the moment. That was quite a rewarding production to work on.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the sort of message from that film, that project?
Sure. It was from a couple of different angles. So the presenter, a guy called Kirk Johnson, who's the director of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., he'd been to some of the places that we were filming at before, but 20 or so years earlier. So part of the show was comparing his experience to before, when he was last there and when we were there now. So when we were up in Ellesmere Island, up in the Arctic, the last time he'd been there, he had some photos of the positions and the scale of the glaciers that were in that area. And they were pretty much non-existent in the particular area that we were at that time. So there was that sort of comparison of how much things have changed. But it was also aiming to try and put into perspective what a lot of the figures, which could just feel a bit lost on many people, it was trying to make that feel more real world and relatable to general life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that thing about being able to hook people, isn't it, into something so that they understand what's going on and then have that relatable quality.
Yeah, I think a big element of it was that it was at the point where a lot of people that were speaking out against sort of climate change activism were saying climate change has happened before, this isn't our fault. And one of the perspectives, or one of the points this show was trying to make, was that yes, it's happened before. We went to, for example, Seattle, and we were talking about how Seattle was actually carved by a glacier. And we were talking about how the fact it has happened before, but it's the important aspect is the rate of change at the moment is unprecedented, and that is as a result of human
the
influence.
acceleration rate is significant, isn't it? It's very extremely concerning. What has been your favorite experience maybe connecting with nature then?
I'd say one of my favorite experiences was on a shoot in the Namib Desert for a show called Wild Babies on Netflix. And this was a show which, on a personal level, was amazing. There was a shoot that I managed to end up working with my now wife on, which was fantastic. But there was this point where we were filming on the Skeleton Coast, and we were filming Cape fur seals and hyenas and jackals. And we were wedged up with a rock face behind us, filming the seals off in the distance, and then potentially a couple of hyenas coming in from different directions. They're brown hyenas, they're all solitary animals, they're not pack hunters. And we were filming them on their way in towards the seals. And the rock face behind me was a shelf about 1.5 meters up. And suddenly I had this shadow pass over me and the camera in front of me. And I couldn't move the camera because it was in front of me and it would have scared it away, but I turned around and there was a brown hyena, adult brown hyena, stood directly above us within arm's reach, staring straight at us, trying to figure out if we were food or foe or worth just ignoring. It stood there for a few seconds, which felt a lot longer, and then eventually just walked off. But not being able to move the camera around and film it without scaring it, I had no choice but to be able to just enjoy it. And that was an amazing experience.
It sounds like a very close encounter.
I was just going to say, Marie, one of the scientists that we were working with on that shoot, she spends an incredible amount of time on her own in the middle of this desert. She's studying the hyenas specifically, and because she's been there for so long, she's developing a bit of a trust relationship with the hyenas, and they are starting to get closer to her now. She's got some fantastic shots of it on Instagram. It's great to be able to keep up to date with the animals that we were watching when we were filming that.
Do you know what the Instagram handle is for the lady you mentioned?
I can tell you. It is Marie. I'll spell it. It might be difficult to get the spelling from the name. So it's MAIELEMERLE.
Brilliant. Yeah, it sounds like a great thing to go and have a look at and see that relationship developing with such wild animals.
Definitely,
what do you think are the positives of wildlife documentaries versus the negative impacts they can have?
There's definitely both. The big overarching positive is bringing the unobtainable world to the masses, allowing people to not just see and experience this wildlife, which they wouldn't necessarily normally be able to see and interact with, but learning about its existence at all. People are going to see and learn about animals that they wouldn't have around them at home, and giving people a reason to appreciate them, and not just appreciate them as a species themselves and their individuality, but the way in which they are connected to the global ecosystem and how they are important and impacting other species, which ultimately also impacts everyone else in the world. It's a great way of encouraging people to basically care more about the environment and the world, because it's all connected. In terms of negative side of the industry, there's obviously the carbon footprint of the productions themselves. So there's flying crew and kit to location, which could seem counterproductive. If you offset it against the positive influence that it's going to have, then I would say that it probably does outweigh that anyway. But I'm part of a group called Filmmakers for Future Wildlife, or FFW, which is a growing grassroots group of people in the wildlife filmmaking industry from every aspect of it, everything from directors and camera operators to people that work for companies that develop the cameras that we then use. And they're all working together to try and find ways of reducing the carbon footprint of the industry, but also producing content which is going to better influence positive change out in the world.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a really great group that you're involved in there. Is that group growing every year as well?
Absolutely growing. I think it's around 2 years old now, so it's still relatively young, but it's been growing really well. And we talk a lot with Albert, who is an organization that is focused on encouraging the media industry as a whole to reduce its carbon impact. And they've got various tools to help you do that, including a calculator to put in certain statistics, and it'll tell you basically what the carbon footprint of your production would be. We've been speaking to them, and they've been really helpful and cooperative as well.
Absolutely. And Buttercup Learning is a member, so that when we get into sort of doing wildlife filmmaking and animation for our e-learning site, that we're building those materials with that guidance as well. I think it's a really good initiative. We see a lot of BBC wildlife documentaries that are We Are Albert certified, which is fantastic.
It's becoming one of the newest career paths or roles in the industry. A lot of the bigger blue chip shows, like Our Planet or Planet Earth, that sort of thing, Frozen Planet, they have one or more people working on the production whose role is to basically manage the environmental impact of that production. So yeah, that's definitely becoming more of a consideration. And even if it's offsetting the carbon that they can't do anything about, but then finding ways of reducing what was used in the first place as well.
Yeah, no, it's certainly food for thought, isn't it? But I agree with you. I think the positives outweigh any negatives, to be honest. Growing up as a child, some of the most poignant and impactful moments have been watching both science documentaries and wildlife films and program series as well on TV. So I do think that we, as a general viewing population, learn so much through those kind of sources, and without them we wouldn't see some of the changes and attitude changes especially that people are having. So I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, there can be some fantastic sort of social waves as well on the back of some of these shows. If you look at was it I think Blue Planet with the straws up the turtle's nose, basically having a huge impact on the laws that are factored into single-use plastics around the world. And various movements like that have had a really positive impact as a result of wildlife film production.
What might surprise listeners and viewers about being a wildlife camera operator?
I'm not sure if it's so specific with the act of being a wildlife camera operator itself, but one thing that I definitely hadn't considered or thought about before I'd started my current career as a freelance wildlife camera operator. I'm not working for a particular company. I've not got the team that I work with, and we just go off on various shoots. I go out on a job, and the job can last from a day to a few months. It's usually about three to sort of 6 weeks per shoot. Most of these people I meet at the airport for the first time. I've never met them before. And then we're thrown straight into it. I'm living with them, spending 24 hours a day with them for the next several weeks. And more often than not, the crew, you become a family. You're living with them. They are everyone that you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis for a long period of time. And that is wonderful. And then it gets to the end of the shoot, and everyone goes their separate way. And some of those people you may never see again. Some of them you might, because it is a relatively small industry, you are going to go on other shoots with again in the future. But effectively that family disappears. And it is a weird feeling at the end of every job of having this sort of this feeling of loss, just because you've had a whole change of lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not many jobs, is there, that you would spend that kind of time with your colleagues, literally living with them and working alongside them.
Yeah. There was a shoot I was on back in 2020. So it was just at the beginning or just before the world went into COVID lockdown. I was on a boat. We were down in Antarctica in South Georgia. And at the beginning of that shoot, I'd gone and met everyone at the airport and met the rest of the crew who were all fantastic. And it was one of the people that I met that day. The whole shoot, we were staying on a boat. I spent the rest of that shoot sharing a bed with a guy that I'd never met before. And then because of the COVID lockdown, no countries were letting us dock to actually disembark. So I ended up spending, I think, an extra month on that boat. But yeah, you get thrown into random families all the time.
So when July 2021, you had an accident, did that change how you feel about your career or make you want to change direction?
Absolutely not. So yeah, I had an accident whilst I was on a shoot out in Italy. I fell off a mountain and broke most of myself, but it's absolutely not had any impact on what I want to do. I've had a couple of more recent forays back out into the shooting world. My plan is for next year, as I approach the sort of 2-year mark after my accident, is to be able to get back out into the field shooting properly. Some of my friends and family think I'm crazy wanting to be back up mountains again, but there's nothing I want more. I love that aspect of my life. I've been incredibly lucky to have the experiences I've had with it so far, but yeah, I'll be doing everything in my power to be doing that again.
Yeah, it's good to hear that you're back out there doing what you love. That's absolutely fantastic. So if I had a child that was interested in a career to do with wildlife, maybe, what advice would you give me?
There's so many different ways to approach the industry, depending on what particular interests they may have. If they're quite technical minded, they could become a camera operator or a drone operator. They could work in the technology sector of the industry, helping develop new technology to be able to film in new and in like innovative ways. But then you've got the more creative elements. So you've got the directing and the researching. You've got that ties into the science side of things. If people wanted to follow more of a strict science side, you can go down the route of doing something like zoology, college and university, and then becoming a researcher, which then would develop into becoming an assistant producer and producer director. There's lots of different directions you can go, but you could even be something more close to home if you didn't want to spend half the year or more out of the country away from your family and friends. You can do jobs that are at home. You could be an editor, you could be an edit assistant, you could be a post-production technician. There are so many different angles. So I went a bit off from what your original question was. What would they want to do? What should they do to get into the industry? So I'd say you certainly don't need to decide what aspect of the industry you want to work in. For my first year or so of working in the industry, I was still trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to do, and I was lucky that I had a position where I was able to try a few different things and see what felt right. But you certainly don't need to decide that straight away. So I'd say the best thing to start out with is to just be as active as you can. So spend time with the wildlife that's on your doorstep, whether it be building a bee hotel and watching them, learning about the insects that are on the plants in your garden in the local park, and the birds and the mammals that are around. But then if you have access to a camera, whether it be a cinematic camera or an SLR or just a phone, you can create amazing films with that and just experiment with it, figure out what shots work, what you require to be able to tell the story that you want to tell. Because whether you're looking at being a camera operator or a director or a researcher, that's going to matter. Knowing what shots you need, what kit is required to get those shots, and how to portray the message that you're trying to portray.
Absolutely. Some really great advice there. Have you got any tips then for emerging wildlife photographers and filmmakers, maybe tech tips?
Not so much tech tips, especially as one of the things there is that by the time this podcast comes out, it'll probably all change anyway. The tech industry moves so quickly that things change really quickly. I'd say that if you're interested in editing a post-production side, just spend as much time as you can using whatever editing tools are accessible to you. Most software that's used in the industry has a free equivalent. So Avid is one of the most commonly used editing platforms. There is a free version of that available. There is free versions of other ones as well. So just get access to that. Either film your own stuff or download stuff from the internet and have a go editing that. If you're looking at doing camera work, same again, just spending time doing it, learning about it, and producing as much as you can, even if it's just for yourself. You don't need to be putting it out online or anything like that. Just learn by doing. That's the best thing you can do. And then when it comes to actively trying to get in the industry, if you go to university, then obviously if you've done a course that is related to the industry, you can use that when applying for jobs, but you don't even need to have done that. There are people that have made big transitions from other industries over to wildlife film. I worked with a woman that was a assistant producer who used to be a police officer. You don't have to come from a background relating to wildlife or technology to make a career in wildlife film.
Absolutely. And I think it's really great that you're just suggesting have a go and don't let the sort of tech or anything stop you. It's use what you've got and have some fun with it, isn't it?
Absolutely. When it comes to actually having a job in the industry, like you don't have to worry about I don't have a super powerful computer or I don't have a really expensive camera, because more often than not the production company is going to be providing that for you anyway, even if you already had your own. So it's not a matter of you needing the finances to set yourself up in that respect. It's just making sure that you've put enough time in to understand what you need to do when you have access to that stuff.
So obviously you've witnessed some amazing scenes of nature and you've been to lots of different places. How do you feel about the impact humans are having on particularly biodiversity loss?
Not to put too much of a downer on the podcast, but it is incredibly depressing. There are not too many places in my career that I've returned to the same place more than once, but even then you can occasionally notice a bit of a difference. But there is, I think in the last 5-6 years at least, there isn't a single place that I've been for a shoot where the locals, sometimes that are in extremely remote places, where they haven't said, first of all, that it's always freak weather. It's never weather as they've got they've got used to for the past few decades or hundreds of years. So that's completely unreliable. But the level of loss that they have and that is going to be impacting all of us, even if we're not feeling it yet, very shortly, is drastic. For the Polar Extreme show that I was mentioning earlier, there was a time we were filming on an island off the coast of Alaska, and their whole livelihood, their way of life was going out on sleds or now skidoos over the sea ice and going sealing. That was their entire livelihood and way of life. And the last few years when we filmed it, and that was already a few years ago, they've had no sea ice up against the edge of their island. Not only has that meant that they've had to change how they live, but the lack of sea ice has meant they've had waves hitting their island, which has been eroding it at such a rate that they've had their homes falling into the sea and washing out, and they're having to move their community that's been living on this island for generations onto the mainland because it's not possible for them to live there anymore.
Yeah. What do you think world governments, or what would you like world governments to do about climate change, biodiversity loss, the environment?
I would like for them to realize the situation we're actually in. There have been some changes which have been made which are good, which are fantastic, but on the whole, it seems that most changes that are put in place by governments at the moment are put in place because they want to look like they are being active and doing something about the climate crisis in the lead up to the next general election in their country. And for example, in the UK, there have been things that have been discussed over the last few years about schemes to help people get solar panels put on their roof. There was one of these schemes which I think was supposed to have a few £1 million put into public getting solar panels put on their roofs. And I think over the last, it's almost a decade old now, I think it's had something like £6,000 handed out, because it's basically a token gesture. It's just there to sound like they're doing things. What we need is we need change, which a lot of people aren't going to like, but it is going to mean that there is a tomorrow. So yeah, we need actual action and not just vocal action.
I think as a parent is something obviously that I'm very concerned with, and it's one of the reasons that I set Buttercup, is to give young families especially, those ideas around what they can do personally. But there is that sense of certain things are beyond the individual, and that's where government and business responsibility obviously comes in and lies sometimes. And I think for me, Some of the actions that I've taken is to write to my local MP to ask them about the various schemes that they're doing, but also to keep applying pressure. Because I think if we all express how we feel about it and what we would like to see happen, it's more likely to happen. But if we don't petition, we don't talk about it, then it doesn't become mainstream, and it just keeps becoming this, we're working towards it. And you're absolutely right. We don't want to be working towards it. We need to take action right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on a slightly more positive note then, and it is good to talk about real things because this is the reality that we're living in. What are you looking forward to as you make your recovery? What's next for you?
I was about to say I'm looking forward to a bit of warmth because it's not particularly warm at the moment. But that said, the majority of my wildlife career has been in polar regions. So I'm used to working in particularly cold places anyway. But it's just being able to work with fantastic teams and produce content that I'm proud of. Even at the beginning of last year, before my accident, I was producing a series of photographs just in my back garden of bees, and even in the UK with the massive loss of biodiversity that we've had, we still have incredible wildlife that is there if you look for it. I'm looking forward to getting out there and producing great content again.
And long may that last, so that we can have documentary and wildlife filmmakers like yourself involved in telling the world stories that we need to hear. Is there anywhere that we can see your stuff online, Josh, that you would recommend us go and view?
You can always check out whilst it still exists. I'm on Twitter and on Instagram, both of it. My username is Josh Forwood. And then from either of those, there's also a link to my website where sometimes if I've worked on a bigger production, I'll do a short write-up from there, and if it's a publicly accessible thing, I'll link to it so people can go and view the work there as well.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Curious About Nature. If you would like to keep getting nature and outdoor learning stories and tips, hit subscribe in the podcast so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to give a 5-star rating and review to support our podcast reach. To deepen your child's connection with nature and natural world education, please check out the Nature Curious subscription box. Head over to the website buttercuplearning.com to further support your family's nature journey.